Okay, we're going to talk about autonomous weapons systems, also known as killer robots. We know that we already have a ban on chemical weapons, landmines, cluster bombs, biological weapons, and even more. And now we have this debate internationally on autonomous weapons systems. The pandemic, I understand, has slowed down the debates internationally. But now talks are ongoing in Geneva, so that's a good thing. It's important to talk about, and Belgium has played an important role and is sharing now the government expert group in the United Nations. For the definition, because I think the definition will be very important of what are we talking about? Autonomous weapon systems. So I will ask you guys this in a minute. But it's weapons where there is no human interference anymore in deciding whether or not to hit a target, kill or destroy, and destroy. So no human interference is needed anymore. And it's important to know that these weapons already exist. They're not allowed, as far as I know. But I have seen on internet sites that they are on the market. There are weapons that have an option, fully autonomous modus. So it's possible to buy them already. Big question is, of course, what are the legal, ethical, moral questions, technical questions that need to be asked on these weapons? Should they be banned? Would it be allowed to conduct research, development? How far do we have to go? And we're going to talk about all these issues with Ousman Noor, the government relations manager of the campaign to stop killer robots. And the campaign is a network of 180 NGOs around the world. 85, all right, it's growing. And you are calling for negotiations and an international treaty on these weapons with the demand that human control is ensured. And very important to say, the campaign is today in Belgium to receive the Peace Prize of the city of Ypres. It's the prize you won last year, but due to the pandemic, you receive it now, so congratulations. Here next to me I have Professor Tony Belpaeme, professor at Ghent University and also in robotics and cognitive systems at the University of Plymouth in the UK. You received a PhD in computer science here at VUB. And you also study cognitive robotics and human-robot interaction. Okay, I did my homework. And I'm very pleased to have Laura de Grève with us. She's from the Red Cross and an expert in international humanitarian law for the Belgian Red Cross. You also advise the Belgian government on issues related to humanitarian law. And you follow in your role also the international discussions on the autonomous weapons. But I'm not here to speak, I'm here to listen and to moderate between our speakers. So maybe, first of all, it's important to know what are we talking about? What are autonomous weapon systems and why is it important to speak about this? And I think I should start with Ousman Noor for the campaign. You can just explain for a few minutes what we are talking about.
What are we talking about? We're talking about autonomous weapon systems and the technical definition that is agreed both with the ICRC and the campaign and the vast majority of the world's countries is systems that can select and engage targets automatically without direct human involvement. And so instead of a human, they rely on sensors and the processing of sensor information. A sensor could be a weight sensor, as it was for landmines, for example. It could be a thermal recognition sensor. It could be a facial recognition sensor. But the point is that it's not a human being. And so the difficulty with these weapons is that they rely on the processing of sensor information rather than the direct, context-specific, situation-dependent evaluation of a human being at the time the force is applied. So we're taking away the role of the human being from the use of force. And that's the grave error where all of the other problems start to enter. That's the definition, that's the scope of technologies that we're talking about.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. We'll get into that, of course. Laura de Grève, from the perspective of humanitarian law, why is it important to at least discuss what the framework should be to use these weapons?
Well, as Ousman already said, autonomous weapons are weapon systems that select and apply force to targets without humanitarian intervention. So after initial activation or launched by a person, an autonomous weapon system will self-initiate or triggers a strike in response to an information from the environment received through sensors or on the basis of a generalized target profile. This means that the user does not choose or not even know the specific target, nor the precise timing and or location of resulting application of force. Related to international humanitarian law, there are rules that are applicable in the conduct of hostilities. There are basic principles that are always applicable, and even though there is no specific treaty at the moment for autonomous weapons, it's clear that the basic rules of IHL apply to them. For example, the principle of distinction requires that parties to the conflict at all times make a distinction between persons participating in hostilities and those who are not participating in hostilities, for example, civilians. Mm-hmm. At the same time, there also should be a distinction between, for example, military objectives and civilian objects. There is a question whether or not, and already said, that this qualification must be qualitatively assessed in each operational context and could also evolve according to the circumstances. For example, a civilian participating directly in hostilities can be participating in various ways and can also lose his protection at that time, during the time that he's participating in hostilities. Just as a combatant or a civilian who participates in hostilities can also surrender or can react in various ways when the person is wounded. So the question is if this kind of autonomous weapons will be able to make those distinctions and can make the distinction between a military objective and civilians and civilian objects. That's one of the examples that I can cite, but I can go into more detail if you want.
We'll do that later, of course, because it will be important, because the big question is how technical are these weapons, so we'll get into that as well. And I'm pretty sure that we'll come to your expertise.
So yes, I'm a researcher in robotics and artificial intelligence, so I can't really speak on the legal aspects, but the technical aspects worry us. So as researchers, we're very concerned of recent developments where artificial intelligence turns out to be quite good in the meantime at distinguishing between targets, and at the same time it also becomes cheaper and cheaper to actually deploy that kind of artificial intelligence, and we're very concerned about the way this is heading. So for example, as everyone will try to develop these weapons, there might be an AI arms race, which is something that we would not like to see. So just as the biologists don't like to see biological weapons, or chemists don't like chemical weapons, AI researchers don't want technology to be misused. And that's why it's very important that we have this discussion.
Okay, but the big question is, it's a weapon that will work on artificial intelligence, but you say the artificial intelligence is good, because humans can make mistakes as well, so maybe an autonomous weapon will make less mistakes?
That is one of the positions that some people are taking. So some would say, like, well, you know, in war, there is collateral damage, and for example, you could deploy artificial intelligence to avoid that. So AI could be clearer, it does not have emotions, does not have experience fatigue, and it doesn't suffer from the fog of war. It just goes straight to the target, makes that decision, and deploys. And so a number of nations are using that as an argument and saying, like, these autonomous weapon systems are humanitarian systems. They're not the dumb mines that we would have that just explode upon contact. Instead, we have artificial intelligence that really can make that distinction between a civilian and a combatant, and so engage just the right people at just the right time. And it's an interesting discussion, I think, because they might be right. They might be right that indeed AI has the potential to do all these things and that autonomous weapon systems are actually quite humanitarian weapon systems. But at the same time, there is this concern that we'll have this AI arms race. These weapons are going to become very cheap. It's not like a nuclear weapon where not only the knowledge but the infrastructure is incredibly hard to get hold of. These autonomous weapon systems are, you can make them in a shed, really. And they're going to be cheap if they're industrially produced, and they're going to fall in the wrong hands. And that is a major concern. So it's kind of weighing up a number of options, and I think that the negative options stack up, are heavier weighing than the positive options.
Mm-hmm. Noor, Ousman, how do you look at that when people say, but maybe artificial intelligence is smarter than people?
Sure, I mean, artificial intelligence can be a great thing. We're not against artificial intelligence. What we're saying is that a human ultimately should be in control of it. A laptop, a machine, does not understand the identity, the experience, the history, the dignity of a human being. Only a human being can look at another human being in the eyes and recognize itself. A machine has none of that. It's only a series of processes of ones and zeros, and is totally cold and clinical. That can have advantages. But we say a human being should be the master of the technology, not the other way around. And our focus is to say, great, develop artificial intelligence. Many advantages of artificial intelligence, many advantages of technology. But who's in charge of this? If we can accept, as we have done in many other contexts, that human beings should be in control of things like privacy, as we have accepted across the European Union for the General Data Protection Directive, that for our privacy, we need to have meaningful control? Should we not accept that a human should also be in control of life and death decisions when we come to deploy force in the battlefield? Use technology. Make it accurate. Make it beneficial. Apply it with dignity and human rights and peace. And we can have a framework that actually benefits humanity. So we're not against technology. We say that the human is at the center of that, and that should be in terms of the person using the weapon and the person against whom the weapon is going to be used. We should be able to control and take responsibility for the technology that we are creating, and we ask for meaningful human control over these decisions. Not that we're against technology.
How widely produced or research and development centers are there actually for autonomous weapon systems? What are the main manufacturers or possible manufacturers?
There is billions of dollars being invested in increasingly sophisticated levels of sensors and processing of sensors, to the extent that one could take a photo of you and have a sense of what color your eyes are, how big your head is, what color your hair is, and be able to detect you in amongst this crowd. And if that was to be deployed with a bomb, say that they were going to look for you or me, that technology already exists. And we also have increasing capabilities in mobility of weapons, such as drones. So when you combine these factors together, as we are starting to see on the battlefield this year, you've got a potential for facial recognition technology being used on combination with mobile drones, being disconnected from the human commander, and being deployed far away from anyone who's actually in control over that system, and applying force, potentially lethal force, taking life, without any real connection between the action and the consequences of those actions. That technology exists and is being ever more sophisticated, with swarms of drones being developed, and they'll be able to communicate with each other, to be able to do ever more destructive capabilities. And so what we need to have is a realization that these technologies are potentially beneficial, but who should be in control over them? It should be us. And ultimately at the point of use, where the consequences of the actions are most important, is when they're going to be used. The person in control activating that machine should understand what that machine is going to do, should be trained in how that machine works, should be able to engage with what that machine is going to do, and have limitations as to the time and space of that machine in order to use it with mastery, with control, meaningful control, so that the machine ultimately obeys the human.
What countries do we have to look for? What countries have the biggest arms industries that are close to developing, or maybe even already developing these weapons?
The USA has been for decades the world's leader in military investment, so we know that the USA is investing in this type of technology. We also have Russia to a lesser extent, but Israel to a great extent, with a lot of American funding. We know that China has mass surveillance across its own country and has the capabilities to do this kind of damage. And within Europe, we have potentially the UK with, investments in this type of technology. But those are the outliers, actually. Those are the few. The vast majority of the world is demanding that we have meaningful human control. And even those countries recognize the dangers of losing meaningful human control. The only difference with them is they say, leave us to it, we'll do what we want to do. The rest of the world is saying, we recognize the dangers and we need to establish new norms to prevent, as my colleague, I forgot her name, was saying, to prevent an arms race. We have this opportunity now, before this proliferates and becomes really beyond our control, to set new norms to prevent those outliers from getting away with creating ever more destructive processes and machines. And if that is allowed to happen, we all suffer. Mm-hmm. So most of the world is in favor of our campaign's objectives and the ICRC's position. But
some are defending the use of these weapons. With what kind of
There's a number of reasons you could. I mean, if you look at the US, for example, they will say that these weapons are smart and would, for example, self-destroy or self-neutralize at a given point, make that decision for themselves, and kind of just a mine that lies somewhere for a few days and then realizes that the enemy has gone and then neutralizes itself. They're not confused, they're precise. They're, the automated target identification. So, for example, the US struggles a bit with the meaningful control of autonomous weapon systems. And to be fair, as a researcher, they do have a point, because when are you going to... So the insistence of a campaign against killer robots is that someone is there to pull the trigger, to make the decision, the kill decision. But can you do that? Is the time you sometimes have, the window you have between the weapon arriving and you making the decision is less than a second at times. Things move incredibly fast. So will people have the ability to actually take control over the weapon? Will they be too slow? Will they have enough situational awareness, so realizing what is going on around the weapon, assessing the situation, and will they not make the same mistakes? And so countries that are in favor of autonomous weapon systems will say that indeed we people can't really have meaningful control. Stuff moves too fast. So I'm really curious to know what your answer is to that.
Meaningful control is context specific. It will depend on a wide range of circumstances, and we don't seek to prescribe a set series of limitations on what meaningful control can be, ultimately that we say that it should be meaningful. And in our publications, we have said there are a range of factors that ought to be considered. Firstly, for example, what is the thing that you're targeting? Are you targeting an incoming missile? If so, potentially the parameters of time and space will be a different level of the extent of time that you may be willing to permit a machine to take down an incoming missile might be longer duration than if, for example, you were targeting a building in which there may be civilians and the situation is dynamic and you don't know who's quite inside that building. And the space limitations will depend on the environment in which the autonomous weapon system is going to be deployed. Are you deploying it in a desert, in an ocean, in a populated area? Of course, there's going to be different considerations applying in all of those different environments. What level of training does the human commander have over the system that they're operating? Infinite, really, amounts of different factors that are going to apply, and we don't seek to prescribe limitations to all of those. All we say is that it should be meaningful. And why did we choose that word, meaningful? Because the word meaningful is a word that we all understand, and it means meaningful. Meaningful is meaningful. And it implies something more than, let's say, sufficient. Some countries have been saying we should have sufficient control. Why do we not like that word? Sufficient control implies a balancing exercise potentially between the military necessity that the military commander, the objective that they have to fulfill, and the potential risks of executing that force in a micro way. Sufficiency implies something that is to do with the objective that needs to be completed. Whereas the word meaningful implies something about the quality of human experience. A meaningful decision means a connectivity to each other, something about our norms, something about our shared humanity. And it may seem small, a pedantic difference, but I think in common language, when we talk about, is this a meaningful thing? It implies something more than, is it good right now? It also means, how do I feel about this? What have I been taught? What is my experience? Is this going to be good for us? So that's a good word. The level of control that we ought to have over technology that are potentially going to be making life and death decisions. And it is actually the word that has been accepted by the European Union for the control that we need over our own data, our own privacy. If we want meaningful control over our privacy, we should have meaningful control over violence. And it's a good word, and we don't seek to, as I said earlier, say X and Y is okay. That's not future-proof. Those things can change, but meaningful is meaningful.
It's especially important if things go wrong, because we want someone to be responsible, and then we come to the law, legal issues. What are for you the main legal issues with autonomous weapon systems?
Yes, so can I come back to that? I just want to pick in on
sure.
Artificial intelligence. I think it's important also to underline that the definition used by the Red Cross compasses also autonomous weapons that don't rely on artificial intelligence or machine learning techniques. So we don't have to focus on the sophistication of the weapon, but rather on the characteristics that there is no human intervention in the selection or the applying of force to a specific target. Just to say that landmines can also be considered as rudimentary autonomous weapon systems. And it's also important to underline, I think, that autonomous weapons already exist in the definition of the Red Cross. For example, air defense systems with autonomous mothers.
Yes.
Active protection weapons used on tanks for incoming munitions, load-tier munitions on autonomous modes. So these are autonomous weapons that are currently being used, but they are used in a way that they are quite limited. For example, the use of them are limited in the scope when they are used, in situations that they are used, or to specific targets. But given the increase in technologies, the Red Cross has been advocating, has been raising concerns about these autonomous weapons since 2011. but since early this year, May 2021, it actually called states to negotiate new legally binding rules. And that's on the basis of the conclusion that although we have international humanitarian law, which is applicable in armed conflicts and applies also on means and methods of warfare. It limits the use of means and methods of warfare.
It's not enough now for these weapons.
Well, so you have basic principles, but even in the discussions that we saw in the last decade, we saw that states have a different view on how these principles apply on these weapons. And therefore, the International Committee of the Red Cross has now taken the position that we have to go and negotiate new legally binding rules. And this takes the form, in the recommendations of the International Committee of the Red Cross, takes the form of both prohibitions on certain autonomous weapons, on the one hand, and the regulation on other types of autonomous weapons. And that's to highlight the complexity of when we are talking about autonomous weapons.
It's a whole range of different kinds of weapons.
Different kind of weapons.
Yes.
And I think it's important in the discussions and the negotiations moving forward that we take into account this complexity, so that we don't limit it now to what we know already, but that we include future autonomous weapons that could be developed.
Yes.
And so the International Committee of the Red Cross pleads for a prohibition on autonomous weapons that are designed or used in a manner that their effects cannot sufficiently be understood or predicted or explained. So what are also called fully autonomous weapons. For example, because the user cannot anticipate the possible effects that weapon might have. For example, when you are speaking about the principle of proportionality, the principle of proportionality requires that when it is clear that the collateral damage that is caused by an attack, if that collateral damage is excessive in the comparison of the military advantage of destructing a certain military objective, then this is prohibited. But how will this be assessed by an autonomous weapons is the question.
But can a human being always assess that? Because it sometimes goes so fast in war?
Yes, and so if you look at targeting processes of militaries, they have a certain system that leads that applying those principles. And it's also because they know the effects of the weapons that they are using, that they know, okay, if I use this kind of weapon on this specific target, then the blast radius will have this effect. And so I also see at that time, okay, there are no civilians in the vicinity. These are all kind of situational contexts that you have to take into account when you're targeting in conflict areas.
Okay. So a complete prohibition of fully autonomous weapons then?
What we call unpredictable autonomous weapons.
Okay, unpredictable.
And then on the other hand also a prohibition on autonomous weapon systems that are designed or used to apply force against persons. Because again, this is also related to the fact that there might be also ethical concerns and that you leave it up to a machine to decide on life and death. But also that the capacity of a person can be very difficult to analyze in a situation. I gave the example of a soldier that is surrendering. How will a machine say that because a person that is surrendering, so a soldier that is surrendering can be considered as out of combat because he's not participating in hostilities anymore and he's in the hands of the enemy. How will that machine assess this? Or a wounded soldier, but who is still participating in the hostilities or not? So this is why it's difficult, extremely difficult to make these kind of distinctions.
Okay.
And then, on the other hand, besides the prohibitions on autonomous weapons that are used against persons and unpredictable autonomous weapons, we also have to limit other autonomous weapons through a combination of legally binding limits, limits on the types of targets, for example, constraining them to objects that are military objectives by nature. And there again, I have to go back to the definition of a military objective, but a military objective is an objective that is by nature, use, location, or can have a direct contribution to the military hostilities. And so it's important to say, because, for example, a school that is used, for example, at that time by a military or armed forces, then it can become a military objective. But how will this, again, will be assessed is the question. Limits on the duration or the scope of the scale of the use is also important, or the situations where these kind of weapons are used. For example, when you're using autonomous weapons in densely populated areas, most likely this will pose a lot of risks for the civilian population. And so this is our kind of limits that we propose moving forward in negotiations, including also requirements for the human-machine interaction to ensure the effective human supervision of a weapon. And then it has to be decided when this supervision has to be maintained, and also that there is a timely intervention and deactivation possible when necessary.
Okay. When you look at that from the technical perspective, do you think that's a good difference that they make between complete prohibition and limitation?
So I'm skeptical, actually, and really, as my main concern is that in 2015, a group of academics led by Stuart Russell, professor at Berkeley in the US, signed a letter, and lots of people signed. Elon Musk, the late Stephen Hawking, all expressing their concern and their desire to ban weapons. And Stuart Russell's argument really was that these weapons will fall in the wrong hands, and I haven't heard you mention that at all. So I'm a bit agnostic about how good the AI is going to be. The AI might be better, might be worse, but I don't think that's the argument, because AI will get better and it will cause less collateral damage and it will be more precise. That's just going to happen. Don't know when, but it's going to happen. But what we also expect as academics really is that all these weapons are going to fall in the wrong hands, and so I'm a bit kind of annoyed by the fact that some weapons are going to be allowed and some won't, or that meaningful control is asked, while meaningful control can be switched off at any time, I assume. I bet that you can't really check if meaningful control was present at the time of using the weapon. I'm sure that it would be rather easy to switch off the need for meaning control in the weapon, and that any manufacturer of weapons would gladly, for the right price, offer that option to its customers. What happens if these weapons are used by terrorist groups? And I'm a bit, it's almost as if the whole initiative of legislating the use of autonomous weapons falls short, because it's not addressing that main concern that we as academics have, and that is the use by terrorist groups or the use by just unorganized groups or kind of not state actors that would use these autonomous weapons.
So you would go further and be in favor of a complete ban?
Yes, I'm going to play devil's advocate. I'd like to know why we can't have a complete ban.
Is that the question for me?
Oh, yes.
All right, well, look.
But maybe it's politically it's not
a complete ban on all systems that select and engage any target.
Would that be possible?
Is that what you're asking?
Trouble is, we need the definition first. And without the definition, we can't have a ban. And the definition is vague at the moment.
So what are you suggesting that is entirely banned?
If you say autonomous weapon systems, you're banning anything that responds automatically. So indeed, systems that would, attack incoming missiles, or a tank defense system, I don't know, landmines, etc. That's all. Are these autonomous weapons? So we need to kind of draw lines somewhere. Mm-hmm. And once we've drawn that line, could we not just say, like, okay, let's ban all that? Because it's going to go wrong. And sure. I'm not talking about big, metal men walking around the battlefields wielding machine guns. It's going to be your tiny drone with a small explosive charge that flies into a football stadium and hits supporters of the other team, or hits people, I don't know, looking a particular way, having a particular skin color, being on the wrong side of the stadium, and that's what I'm concerned about, and with me, many academics.
Sure. Well, let me clarify the campaign's position, and I know it's the same as the ICRC's position in respect to prohibitions. We say that all autonomous weapon systems that select and engage targets that are designed to target humans should be banned. So that is an outright prohibition on systems that are designed to target human beings. We have heard that there are a range of complications with IHL, International Humanitarian Law, about principles of distinction and proportionality and precaution, which are fundamentally incompatible with having an autonomous weapon system targeting a human being, because an autonomous weapon system cannot distinguish between a combatant and a civilian, and a combatant that is surrendering and a combatant that is injured. It's not feasible. And even if it was, there is something morally repugnant about encoding patterns of the features of a human being into data, which is what an autonomous weapon system that is designed to target human beings would have to do. So if you've got a programmer who is looking for the proxy representations of a human being and encoding that in patterns of data such as our height, our skin color, our size, our face, that ultimately transforms a human being into a series of ones and zeros. That's what the programmer has to do in order to fulfill that task. That is wrong. One cannot distill the essential qualities that we all recognize in each other of a human being into ones and zeros. You cannot put human dignity onto a USB stick. You cannot put experience, love, humanity onto a USB stick. Those should be prohibited entirely. So there it sounds like we agree. Other types of targets. Well, here there is potentially more room for discussion. If you've got, as already exists, a system that detects an incoming missile, if you're on, as we know, it already exists, you've got a ship mounted with an anti-missile system that is looking in the sky using its radar functionality to look for an incoming missile and has the ability to traject an additional missile in order to shoot down that missile. In our mind, that is potentially acceptable. And it already exists. We still say there should be meaningful human control there. And one would analyze that situation and say, okay, what are you targeting here? You're targeting an incoming missile that potentially would kill people on a ship. Okay, so there's a good reason to use autonomy here. How fast is that thing coming in? It's coming in too fast for us to be able to look at it with our own eyes and be able to do anything about it. Okay, so maybe there's a good reason to use autonomy here. In what space is this thing going to be used? It's in the ocean, so there's probably unlikely to be a large amount of collateral damage. Okay, another good reason for potentially using autonomy here. Ultimately, though, the barometer for whether or not the system should be exercised is whether or not it is meaningful. And all these factors need to be looked into. And that could be dynamic. Perhaps that ship is near a port where there are other human beings. Maybe there's more danger there. Maybe actually you should turn that system off right now because it's no longer meaningful. Are you in a space where there's lots of civilian aircraft and your system could get confused with a civilian aircraft? Okay, maybe we need to be a little bit more careful. Maybe we need to turn the system off right now. So because there is an infinite amount of different scenarios and potential justification for using autonomous weapon systems, as I was illustrating, I think, in that example, we don't say that there should be a ban on all autonomous weapon systems, merely that we need to be in charge of it, we need to make sure that is meaningful, and meaningful means looking at all of the circumstances that you're dealing with.
What with the argument that those weapons, because if part of these weapons are allowed, limited, but they are allowed, they can still fall in the wrong hands?
Well, these are the wrong hands. This is not what we're interested in talking about. We're not interested in talking about whether the US position on who's the goodies and the baddies is the right one, or the Chinese position is the good or the right one. We're talking about a fundamental shift in how we are using technology in warfare for the whole of the world.
Let's say they fall in non-government hands, insurgent groups, terrorist groups, activists, whatever.
I don't want to enter a conversation about the legitimacy of independence movements or whether we call them terrorists. This is unhelpful terminology, and we're not politicians. We don't belong to any political group. We're a campaign that has representation in 67 countries with 185 member organizations, each with legitimate views about what is legitimate power. What we're interested in is making sure that the technology that we develop is ultimately in our control so that it can be exercised with human values. So for me, it's an irrelevant question about terrorism or non-state actors. Frankly, this is not how we want to approach this conversation. This is about all of humanity, left wing, right wing, everything in between. We're talking about making sure we're in control over technology.
Mm-hmm. How do you look at that? Because it's something that you see happening with other weapons, that governments aren't using them, but groups, military groups.
Yes, so I think here it's important to underline that armed groups are also parties to the conflict, and are also they also should respect international law. So they're also bound by these rules, has been discussed, the rules of distinction, precautions, proportionality. So they're also binding on armed groups. If they would be using autonomous weapons, they should also be applying these principles. And I wanted to come back on your question about accountability. And that's also related to the characteristics of autonomous weapons, because it's the individual that is using a certain weapon that can also be responsible for violations of international law. And a user that doesn't know the effects, how can then there be an intent? So when we are talking about, for example, violations of IHL, it's important to see, okay, is there an intent to violate these rules? If that's not the case, because the intention is left over to the machine, then it's difficult maybe to establish. But in general, states can be held accountable for international breaches of international law, and also individuals can be responsible for war crimes, and also, for example, members of armed groups. So.
Oh, okay. So if there are rules, they apply to everyone.
Yes.
Not only state actors, yes, but also non-state actors. If you are in favor of a complete ban, does that mean that, of course, development is not possible, but also research is not possible?
You can't ever stop the research, because the research is actually technology that would benefit other aims as well. So non-violent applications rely on exactly that technology. So you can't stop the research. What you could do is, for example, just say, like, look, we can't build these weapons. We can't have our industry, our national industry, or build these weapons and sell these weapons. That's a very straightforward thing to do. Of course, many nations won't agree with that. But for example, at a national level, say Belgium could just immediately say, we will not ever develop these weapons, and our industry, we can't ship parts to other companies building that across our borders. It's relatively straightforward to just implement those bans, and you will never be able to stop the people building autonomous weapons in their garden shed, but at least you'll stop the defense industry of making a profit out of those kinds of systems.
Mm-hmm. Let's go to the negotiations, because that's what everyone is aiming for. Most countries are against fully autonomous weapons. Why is it so hard? I heard you say, Laura, we have been asking this since 2011. That's 10 years. Why does it take such a long time to come to an agreement?
Well, I think that, Just to be clear, the International Committee of... Sorry. Just to be clear, the International Committee of the Red Cross has been calling for discussions about autonomous weapons, but only recently decided to call upon states to adopt new legally binding rules. I think has been a lot of discussions in Geneva about the definitions, the characteristics of these autonomous weapons, and then the terms of meaningful human control.
Yes. Yeah.
But I think, following from my personal perspective, I think there has been building a consensus of these terms. And I think more and more we come together to see that there are a certain consensus of these terms, even though we are still might be using different terms, we mean the same thing. And I think that's leading up now to a momentum to go a step further, actually, in negotiations.
How do you see that, Ousman? Because it takes long discussions. Is there changing something?
Yes.
Are countries coming closer together?
Yes.
That's good news. Okay.
To use an expression that we've said a lot this week, there has been a wind of change in Europe this year.
Where does the difference lie?
Apart from the campaign, I'm going to give credit to the ICRC's position. The ICRC has been respected for decades as a guardian of international humanitarian law. States all around the world respect, at least in principle, the idea of international humanitarian law, and when the guardians of that law have said we need new rules to come together and negotiate, that has had a big effect, and I want to pay credit to the ICRC for that. Also our own campaign. We've been active in 67 countries, actually more than 67 countries. Those are just where we have official partners, but actually beyond those. And we have seen an awakening of the realization of the problem. Our campaign is called the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots, and perhaps that's a fun brand, but it sometimes evokes some dystopian sci-fi future. But actually, when we engage with people about the issues that we are facing, what we're seeing is no matter which perspective you come from this issue on, whether it's a human rights perspective, an IHL perspective, a peace perspective, even a military perspective, when you actually grapple with the issues, you do ultimately come to the same conclusion. And it's a slow process. But it's required awareness, it's required a realization of the capabilities of technology, and it's required multilateralism. It's required the last 2 years of the Belgian chair, the ambassador, Mark Pechstein, to force countries to come together in the era of COVID, which has not been an easy thing to do, to discuss these issues and to submit written contributions. And people have got a lot of other things to worry about, and especially in the last couple of years. So these things do take time, but what we've seen is that when people do think about this, they do come to the same conclusion. And this week we've been in IPA, where we won the Peace Prize, and we've been sitting with children who are 17 and 18 years old who probably never thought about this very much before, but when we sit down and talk to them about it, they think, oh my gosh, this is clearly something that we need to do, but it requires awareness, and we're building it, and we're getting there, and we have seen this wind of change, and we are confident that we'll succeed.
But on what points do you see that it's important to give in to some of the points that are non-discussable for some countries maybe, and where maybe the campaign or ICRC said, okay, we can leave that point and then we can take a step further?
No, we don't give in. We've come to our conclusion from thinking about the issue and realizing what needs to be done. Of course, we have obstacles in terms of certain politicians for certain periods of time not wanting to take action because it's not politically expedient for them at that particular moment. But we're not concerned with that. We are here to talk about what is ultimately needed for all of us. And so we don't play politics and say, okay, we should give in to that and maybe accept this. Diplomats do that. That's their task. Mm-hmm. We're here to talk about what is ultimately needed, the vision, based on research, based on engagement with the tech sector, based on a consideration of IHL, based on basic engagement with normal human beings. My mum, when I talk to her about the campaign to stop killer robots, and she's like, what is that about? And I'm saying, you know, a basic description of what we're talking about, it's like repugnant. That exists? The visceral reaction to what we're talking about for most human beings is that shouldn't exist. So we're here to express that. And that's what's sometimes missing in the discussions at the United Nations, and that's what we're here to represent. So we don't give in. We carry on talking about it until we succeed, and we will.
Laura, ICRC made a position in May that also took a while. What was the process that the International Red Cross made?
Well, maybe I should have started my intervention tonight that I'm not from the ICRC, so I'm working for the Belgian Red Cross, which is part of the international movement of the Red Cross, Red Crescent, and the International Committee of the Red Cross is another organization. So, but of course, we are supporting the position of the ICRC. I think it took a while because of course, it was always clear for the ICRC that IHL rules are applicable on autonomous weapons. But it was based on the discussions the last years that we see a divergence on how the states are applying these rules on autonomous weapons. So I think that's why it came from trying to promote consensus of a normative operational framework on autonomous weapons to now recommending new legally binding rules. I think now the momentum is there, and I think it's important now what will happen in December is to see how it moves forward. If there will be a clear mandate that states give for future negotiations for a new treaty, a new protocol to the Convention on Conventional Weapons, or if it takes another direction. And then we can still discuss on the content of this kind of treaty. And I think there are different positions and might still change a bit based on the discussions between states, because ultimately it is the states that are making the new rules and not the civil society. We can only try to influence that process, but it's the states who decide on these rules. And then we will see how it moves forward.
The states and the diplomats, they need some time to come to a treaty, but in the meantime, research and development doesn't stand still, and it keeps evolving. How fast does it go?
It depends. Sometimes we're too optimistic about artificial intelligence, and that is why we overtrust AI. AI isn't that good. The media paint it as this golden technology that will solve all problems. That's not how it works. Yeah, AI is quite fickle. It breaks down as well, and it can be easily fooled. So especially in a military setting, if you ever want to fool autonomous weapons, come talk to me. There's so many ways in which you can confuse those weapons as well. So we're not there yet. You can build simple systems that, for example, fly to a GPS location. You can have systems that will detect people and could engage, for example, fire a machine gun. You can have drones that recognize simple targets and fly there. The AI necessary to make these very precise, discriminate weapons does not exist and will not exist for a long time. And even though AI is moving at breakneck speed, if you see what large companies such as Google, for example, is the biggest AI developer on the planet, throwing possibly billions of dollars at the problem, it's amazing what they're achieving. But at the same time, they're nowhere really. There's a paradox in artificial intelligence called Moravec's paradox. And it says that anything that looks easy to us is almost impossible for a machine. And anything that we find easy is very difficult for a machine. So, for example, recognizing someone and assessing a situation, especially in a combat situation, is okay, we can do this as trained soldiers. We should be able to do. Oh, I'm not me, but a trained soldier should be able to do that. But it actually, following that paradox, it means that it's incredibly hard for artificial intelligence to make that same assessment. So when will we have that AI? I don't know, 20, 30, 50, 100 years from now. But I think you can be quite confident that this is going to happen. And you don't need clever AI. That's the other important thing. You can have quite simple AI that, for example, just attacks people with particular skin color. And that is feasible. And just because already those simple systems, we can build those, and they're not complicated to make. Any engineering student can build this in a few months' time. It just... we should take action now, and I think it can only get worse. Yeah? It's not that the AI is going to get better and that we're going to have more precise, more humanitarian weapons, because these weapons are going to fall in the wrong hands. There's just no question about it. The fact that they're so cheap, that they're so accessible, they are going to be used in situations that are not humanitarian at all.
So time is taking to come to an international treaty. What are the countries that are important to take the lead? And on the other hand, a small country like Belgium, Belgium has taken the lead in the prohibition of landmines, of cluster munition. Can Belgium play a role?
Belgium's been playing a very positive role this last year, and in fact for the last few years. There are a number of good reasons for that, and you've just said one of them, which is that they've got a history of taking leadership, as you said, for landmines and cluster munitions. The second good reason, and it's something that has profoundly hit me and in a very emotional way since arriving to Ypres, where we went to the In Flanders Fields Museum and commemorated and remembered the history of war in this country, where at that time, in the First World War, the latest technology in warfare was chemical weapons, and it was released and had devastating, horrific consequences in this country. And what's beautiful about Ypres is how they have learned from that and moved from that and renovated and recreated and respected the history of that. And now we're dealing with a new wave of new technology. And I think Belgium is, in its collective consciousness, remembering the horrors of that and in a position to say, actually, let's stop this from happening before we have that happening again. Tomorrow is Armistice Day, and we'll pay commemoration to that exact moment in history. So there's that. I think the third reason is Belgium is a country that doesn't have strong military aspirations, but has a huge invested interest in multilateral disarmament, peace negotiations, and actually has a lot of significant influence there. It's a country in the European Union, and it's a country in NATO, but it is a country that, unlike the UK, let's say, for example, which is my country, where I'm from, doesn't have pretenses like the UK of being a significant military dominant power. And so its main tool for influencing the world is through its voice, through its people, through its action in multilateralism. And we've seen that through the ambassador and through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs over here actually taking action on that front. Those are some of the reasons, and I can say from the conversations that I've been able to have with diplomats in the United Nations, a lot of countries in Africa, in Asia, and then in Latin America, who, by the way, the vast majority of them have said on record, we need a legally binding framework, we need prohibitions, and we need regulations, are actually looking to countries like Belgium to say, actually, we want that too, and to unlock some of the anxieties that some of the other European countries have. And it does take a country like Belgium to unlock that anxiety, and you'll start to see other countries in Europe saying, okay, Belgium's taken some lead over here. We're not going to be alone if we do this, you know, and you start to see other countries fall in. We're seeing that also in Austria. We've seen that I think we will be seeing that in Norway with the recent election result. We're starting to see that in Germany. We've seen this in Ireland, which is actually, for some of the same reasons that I've just given, similar to Belgium. And we are confident that this wind of change has arrived. And so next year, after this review conference, which is necessary to happen, where we don't think there is going to be a mandate to negotiate a legally binding instrument because of those outliers I mentioned at the beginning, not willing to do that, we will see next year, I think, some countries taking initiative on a new treaty process, and I'm sure Belgium will be there.
What will be the next steps, Laura, in these negotiations?
Well, I think that has been discussed already. I think that now there is the last session of the GG laws. Sorry. So now in December, a next last session chaired by Belgium of the GG laws will take place, and then it's the review conference on the Convention of Conventional Weapons, and there, indeed, there will be a decision on the mandate of the GG laws moving forward, and whether or not this mandate includes, of course, a negotiation of a treaty or continue the discussions as have been taking place this year. So, to be seen what happens.
Okay.
But I think, the predictions is difficult to see now.
Yes, but I'm still going to ask predictions. How do you see this issue of development on one hand and coming to a treaty?
So I don't know. I'm not sitting at the negotiation table, so I don't know how things are going when you're talking at the level of the UN or what happens.
But time is ticking, because you also were in this open letter in 2017 and said, this is really urgent. We're 4 years later.
It is indeed 4 years later, nothing really has happened. And I think, yeah, it's very concerning. I'm a bit disappointed, for example, in the national politicians who came and sought us out to write this particular letter, and I rallied my colleagues in Belgium to just behind that letter, where we took a very clear standpoint, and then the politicians kind of got their 5 minutes of attention really in that particular debate and left. And I'm worried that similar things are happening. There are, not only are politicians, as you say, they come and go, and sometimes they're supportive, sometimes they're not. But things are moving at a glacial pace, and it's not a good thing. And the other problem is, for example, definitions are still very vague. This concept of meaningful human control. Some Merel Ekelhof wrote that's an intuitively appealing concept, immediately that immediately gained traction, but it comes at a familiar legal political cost. Nobody knows what the concept actually means in practice, and so insisting on this meaningful control it's not getting us anywhere. I'd almost, I'd like to encourage.
The campaign
to be more forceful and be almost clearer in their language, and not come up with these woolly concepts and kind of pin them down.
Yeah, please.
Well, I'm really happy to hear that coming from someone who's experienced in the tech and the artificial intelligence, because I'm not, and I'm super motivated to hear you saying that we need to go further, because ultimately, we need to be responsive to tech. Now, is the word meaningful human control a woolly concept, and is it something that doesn't really make much sense? Now, I do have a background as a lawyer, and I can say that the law is filled with these concepts that are intentionally flexible. Let's take the European Convention on Human Rights. Article 8. Says everyone has the right to a reasonable family life. What the hell does that mean? Reasonable family life? It is intentionally flexible, because families change, ideas of gender change, ideas of kinship change. But what that word has allowed to happen, and I used to go to court almost every single day, would be allowing us to advocate that in this particular circumstance, in this particular case, this would not be reasonable to separate this child from this parent. And it allowed us that flexibility. And we had many, many different cases. Every case was different. There was cases that involved mental health problems. There was cases that involved someone being deported. There was cases involving someone who had a criminal offense. There was cases where someone was in hospital. There was cases where the mother was not available. Every case was different, and every single weapon will be different. But what that word reasonable allowed us to do was to hold every single case to account and allow us to go to a judge and say, hey, judge, this isn't going to be reasonable. And the judge would say, you know what, when I search my conscience, I don't think it will be reasonable. And it actually allowed a body of case law to develop that actually gave some guidance in each particular case and say, well, if someone's got a criminal sentence of this particular length, that's going to be a heavy factor. We need that type of flexibility, actually. So it is a woolly word, of course it is. But it's intentionally woolly, because every type of autonomous weapon system is going to have different characteristics, is going to be deployed in a different situation, is going to have different target profiles, is going to have different durations of time of operation, is going to have different space parameters, is going to have different sensors that it is using. It might have a thermal sensor, it might have a weight sensor, it might have facial recognition sensor, and sensors that we don't even know about that exist yet, that will exist in the future. So we need a word that is going to encapsulate the human experience and allow us to hold any one of those autonomous weapon systems to account. Is it meaningful? So it is intentionally vague, but it means something. And we all know what the word meaningful means because I'm using the word to describe the word.
How do military leaders and armies look at this definition and look at the use of autonomous weapons? Are they in favor or not?
Yes. We have, there, you know, I don't want to, you know, give away people's identities and such, but the military attaches that I get to speak to in the United Nations, including the one for Belgium, has experience, right? They're human beings that have been trained, that have been educated, that have understanding of ethics, have understanding of law, have understanding of their own colleagues, their own teams, also an understanding of their own enemy, and also an understanding of context. They are experts in what they do. We hope to empower those people and to recognize the abilities that they have and not replace them through a bunch of predetermined algorithmic calculations that could do their job for them. No one will be able to understand the dynamic theater of war as well as a human being. No one will be able to understand the consequences of taking a person's life and the potential gravity of making a mistake in that situation as well as a human being. A machine just doesn't have feelings. It doesn't have experience. It doesn't have an identity. It does it in a cold and calculated way and has no understanding of love. I'm sorry to come back to that word, which is another fluffy word, but it means something. And that's what we hope to protect. And the military commanders respect that. They are good at what they do, and we should uphold that and train them to be good at what they do. And that's what I think is crucial. That's why we say meaningful human control.
Laura, you're also in contact with people negotiating. How do you see, will there be a ban or at least a legal framework within a few years?
I think it will move forward. The question is how fast and how many states are getting on board. And I think there it's also important to underline that even though maybe there might be a majority or a big portion of the states that agree to negotiate new legally binding rules, this will also have an effect on states that are not getting on the train. For example, states that don't want to, at that time, negotiate for a new treaty, they might still adhere to that treaty later on. They might also be adapting their own policies because of they are cooperating with other states in military operations, so that might have an indirect effect. And there are also other measures that can still be taken, besides the legally binding, new legally binding rules. there can be other measures taken by states that can be complementary and in synergy. For example, a political declaration of a state that won't use certain autonomous weapons, the elaboration of international technical standards on the testing or the validation or the verification of autonomous weapons, as well as national moratoriums on the development or procurement of autonomous weapons. So still, whatever happens at the international level might also have an impact on the national positions of states.
It will happen in phases.
It will happen in phases, and I think rules, developing new rules takes time. And it's sometimes frustrating, but I think in the end, in the history of mankind, sometimes we were too late. Sometimes treaties were adapted when the consequences were already very clear. I think we are now at a point that we see the risks. We see that there are already certain autonomous weapons being used, but the scale is quite limited for the moment. And so I think we might be just on time or maybe just too late. So it's to see how it happens.
But no prediction? 1 year, 3 years, 5 years? 1 year?
I will let the campaign decide this.
If it's are hoping to be without a job very soon.
Yes, I hope so. And I'm going to retire on a farm and grow some vegetables and celebrate our victory, really. And I really feel great confidence in our campaign. You know, I've been with the campaign for actually a year and a half. And in our campaign, there are activists, there are lawyers, there are academics, there are teachers, there are parents, there are children, there are people in the tech sector, people from every walk of life with every different type of background. Our campaign began life 8 years ago with a handful of veteran campaigners with the spark of an idea to push for regulation on this issue. And since then, it has spiraled into this huge force. And in the space of 8 years, we've gone from that to where we are right now, and that is continuing to grow. And everyone that I speak to about our campaign feels like we need to succeed. And it's inevitable that we will.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope there are still some questions. We should have an app, you know, that people can send questions. No more questions. Okay, but you have all been very, very clear. I think it was very interesting, and well, you see this point on autonomous weapons is much more complicated than it seems to be when we just think of one weapon, because there's a variety of weapons and there are so many details that are very important. So thank you very much, all of you. Tony, Belpaeme,
Thank you.
and Ousman, Noor,
Thank you so much.
very much.